in the New Testament book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 4, I'm going to read verses 14 through 16. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. The title of the message today is A Friend in High Places. Here the writer is writing with some reference back to the Old Testament, the idea of the high priest offering a sacrifice for the people on the Day of Atonement. That's what's on his mind as he writes here about Jesus. And so beginning in verse 14 of chapter 4, he writes, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession," or a translation of that might be, "hold firmly to what you believe. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence," or boldness, "draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need." Mike Royko was an award-winning journalist for the Chicago Tribune for over 30 years. He wrote about politics. And Royko said that in politics, what makes politics work is what he called clout, or having friends in high places. He said clout is when you're able to call City Hall, for example, and get a speeding ticket taken care of. Clout is when a policeman knows a ward boss, and he can call the ward boss to help him get promoted to sergeant. Clout is when the ward boss can call the mayor on the phone and get a sweetheart contract for his brother-in-law's construction business. Clout is when you can call up the governor and get an appointment with him on short notice, and on and on. He said, this is how politics works. No, it's who you know when you have friends in high places. We all need friends in high places from time to time. Someone who can help us when we can't help ourselves. And this is what is underlying the text that we read this morning. He tells us to hold firmly to what we believe in the midst of hard times. You know, the entire New Testament was written against the backdrop of persecution and suffering. And he's saying to us today, when you are going through persecution, when you are suffering, when you are going through difficult times, hold on to what you believe. And then he tells us why we can do that. And two things I want to call your attention to this morning in this very brief passage. He tells us in verses 14 and 15 that we can hold firmly to what we believe because we have a high priest who sympathizes with us. He begins in verses 14 and 15 by telling us something of the nature of Jesus Christ. And he calls him the great high priest. Now, we don't even have priests today, much less high priests. And so this language may not mean a great deal to us today. But it certainly did to those people. The high priest was chosen from among all of the priests, and for 1 year he would do his duties. He would perform those responsibilities laid out for him. Only the high priest could go into a place in the temple that was called the Holy of Holies. It was a special room. And he only went in there once a year. So only he could go, and only once a year. He would go there behind that curtain, behind that veil, and there where the Ark of the Covenant was held in the mercy seat, he would place a blood on that mercy seat. And it was felt that the mercy seat was where the presence of God dwelled on earth. And after the high priest would do that, and when he would come back out from behind the curtain, the people would breathe a sigh of relief, because the fact that he came out alive meant that God had accepted their sacrifice for 1 more year. Now he's saying that's what Jesus did on the cross for us. that he paid, that he offered a sacrifice for our sin. And he says in verse 15 that he did it without sin. Now, the chief priest, the high priest, when he offered a sacrifice for the sins of the people, he had to offer one for himself first. Before he could offer a sacrifice for the people, he had to offer one for his own sins, because the high priest was a sinner just like they were. Did you know that the Pope has a confessor? Did you know that once a week the Pope goes to confession? It's an acknowledgement that even the Pope, this high religious figure, is a sinner, just as we are. But the writer of Hebrews makes a point of telling us that Jesus did all of this without sin. He never went to bed at night and regretted something that he'd done or something he'd said during the day. He never woke up in the morning haunted by a sin of omission or a sin of commission, a word, a thought, a deed. And he tells us also in verse 15 that our great high priest sympathizes with us. That's a beautiful thought for us to cling to today, that at the heart of the universe is someone who cares deeply for us. That word sympathy comes from a word that means to share in another's suffering or in someone else's weaknesses. That means that your high priest today is not aloof. He's not distant, detached, or removed. You may be going through it today, going through a difficult times, caring for someone who is sick, maybe sick yourself, having difficulties at work or with your family, and you may feel like you can't go on. And the writer is reminding us today that your high priest is someone who sympathizes with you in your suffering and your weakness. Jesus was fully divine, but also fully human. John tells us that one day Jesus sat down after a long journey. He sat down next to a well, weary. John tells us later in the 11th chapter of his gospel that Jesus went to the home of a friend who had died, and he burst into tears. Your high priest is someone who can sympathize with you because he wore your humanity. Everything that you experience as a human being, Jesus experienced and understands. I read about a little boy who went to a home where he saw a sign outside that said puppies for sale. And the little boy thought maybe he could get a puppy, and so he went up to the man's house and rang the bell, and the man came out and he said, "How much are the puppies?" And the man said, "Well, they're $25 a piece." The little boy said, "I don't have $25, but could I see them anyway?" And the man whistled, and around the corner of the house came the mother dog and 4 beautiful little dogs following behind. And then a few seconds later came the 5th puppy, kind of straggling along, and it was limping. One of its legs was lame. And the little boy looked at that puppy, and he said, "That's the one I want. How much is that puppy?" And the man said, "Well, son, that puppy is crippled. There's something wrong with his back hip socket. He'll never run. He'll never even walk properly. Why would you want a puppy like that?" And the little boy reached down and hitched up his pant leg to reveal a brace on his own leg. And he said to the man, "I'm crippled too. That little puppy is going to need a lot of love and understanding." Everything that you experience in life, every heartache, Jesus knew. He knew what it was to be betrayed by a friend. He knew what it was to be bone weary. He knew what it was to be frustrated. He knew what it was to be abandoned by those whom he loved and that he thought loved him. Everything we experience, he understands because he wore our humanity. Someone wrote of Jesus that he can do it on high because he knows what it is to be low. He can do it when he is exalted because he knows what it is to be diminished. He can do it though he is omnipotent because he knows what it is to live in fleshly weakness. He can do it on a throne because he went to a cross. You have a high priest who feels with you, who sympathizes with you in your weakness. And then look what he says in verse 16. You can hang on to what you believe because your high priest offers you grace and mercy. He says in verse 16, let us come boldly, the King James says, boldly before the throne of grace. That word boldly means, in essence, to speak your mind. It means to speak freely. Literally, it means with freedom of speech. That's what he's saying. Let us come before God with freedom of speech. I saw a PBS special this past week. It's about a woman whose husband was killed in 1964. And it was a federal crime, a civil rights violation. And this woman felt like the police weren't doing enough, the FBI wasn't doing enough to find the killer of her husband. And she went to the White House. This was when LBJ was in office. And she got an audience with the president. And she went in to speak with him. And the LBJ's, I don't know what to call them, flunkies, all the people who work around the president, they were all in there. And she gave LBJ a piece of her mind. And one of LBJ's helpers came up and pulled her aside and said, Madam, we don't speak to the president like that. Sometimes we think when we pray, we've got to watch what we say to God. But that's not what he's telling us here. He says when you come before God in prayer, you can unburden your heart. You can say what is ever on your heart and whatever is on your mind. You don't have to watch what you say. You don't have to worry about offending God. You don't have to worry that you're going to say the wrong thing. He says come boldly. And again, that means literally to come with freedom of speech and say whatever is on your heart, whatever is on your mind, whatever you need to say. And that word, which is just translated into English, let us come before the throne of grace, means literally to come repeatedly, to do it over and over again. And he's saying that whenever you need to come before the throne of grace, to unburden yourself, to speak what's on your mind, just keep doing it over and over and over again. You're never going to wear out God. You're never going to make God grow weary with your presence. We all know what it's like to ask somebody for help. And they'll give you help, but boy, they let you know this is a one-time deal. They sort of communicate that to you. Maybe they even say it. You better never show your face around here again. You better never come asking me for help again. I'll help you this time. That's not how God helps us. He says, let us come over and over and over again as often as we need it, to ask for God's help. One of the sweetest verses in all the Bible is James chapter 1 verse 5 that says that when we ask God's help, He gives to us generously and He does not upbraid us. And that word upbraid means to choose someone out. And it's saying that when we come to ask God's help, He just generously gives us what we need, and He doesn't chastise us. That means God is never going to say to you when you come before God to ask His help, He's never going to say to you, no, wait a minute, weren't you just here yesterday? Didn't I just help you with this problem? You're wearing me out. God's never going to say that. The Bible says that we can come boldly before the throne of grace again and again and again, as often as we need it. You have a high priest who is waiting for you to call on Him. And look where he says that Jesus is seated in verse 16. He's on the throne of grace. A lot of people think of the throne of God as sort of like a trip to the principal's office. Do you remember what that was like in school? Somebody gets called to the principal's office. That's not a good thing. Whatever, that comes over the loudspeaker. So-and-so come to the principal's office. Whatever this is about, it's not good. That person's in trouble. And in ancient times, that's how people pictured a king's throne. If you went before the throne, the king would look at you, and if he didn't raise his scepter to acknowledge you, boy, you were done for. You were in trouble. People went before the thrones in historic times trembling. You would never go before a king's throne and look of sympathy and looking for sympathy. You never go before a king's throne hoping for understanding with some problem that you had. But the author of Hebrews is telling us that that's how we can come before God's throne. That we can come before His throne because it is a throne of grace. He makes it clear that we are welcome before the throne, and that when we call on God in prayer, that He not only hears us, He knows who we are. He knows us by name. And what do we receive when we go before the throne of grace? He says we receive mercy in verse 16. Now that's about the past. That's a verse about my past. When I come before the throne of grace, I find mercy. That word mercy means literally active pity. It's saying that I bring to God the brokenness of my life, the unforgivable things of my life, and I lay them before God, and I find mercy. It is the idea of forgiveness, active pity for the things of my past. But then look at what he also says in verse 16. We also find grace, and that's a word about the future. He's telling me that God will give me grace in time of need. Your high priest has an undiminished amount of mercy to cover your past and an unlimited amount of grace to cover your future. You know, the thing about grace, you need it when you need it, right? If you need $1,000 today to pay your mortgage, and if you don't get that $1,000 today, you're going to lose your house. It doesn't help you if somebody gives you the $1,000 next week. You need it today. If you need a medicine to help cure an illness, and if you don't get that medicine, you're going to die. It doesn't help you if somebody invents the medicine next month. You need it today. And that's how grace is. You need it when you need it. And the promise of this verse is that there is grace and mercy to help us. Look what he says in verse 16. When I need it, in time of need. You may not know how you're going to face tomorrow, but I've got good news from you from our text today. God's grace will be there to help you when you need it. That's a promise that you can cling to today. Whatever you are going to face tomorrow, God's grace will be there to help you when you need it. You have a friend in high places. A friend who can sympathize with you in your weakness. A friend who walked the earth just as you do. Who knew what it was to become weary, to experience loss, to be betrayed, to be abandoned. Tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. And because of this, the writer says that we can come with full confidence, with freedom of speech as we stand before Him. And we can continuously come before the throne of grace, knowing that we will receive mercy for our past and grace for our future whenever we need it. Because we have a friend in high places. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 411. 'Tis so sweet to trust